Okay, so I'm sitting here in front of the fire in my little hut that I built in 1983. The kayaking's 2 months over now. We've finished the kayaking 2 months ago, and we're back here doing some conservation work and wrapping up some of the stuff for the kayaking trip.
What got you into conservation in the first place?
So when I was a kid, my parents were into conservation. They were teachers, and their friends were biologists and people that worked in conservation. And I was also always interested in a career in conservation. I remember in the 1970s, sort of the dawning of the awareness of conservation, probably worldwide really. There was various people on TV that spoke about conservation. Jacques Cousteau was one, I think David Bellamy. So these people were starting to bring the concepts of conservation, which was to preserve things. Up until then, I think most people in the world just thought that the wilderness was something to be subdued and replaced by farmland. And that definitely was what was happening in New Zealand until the 1970s. In the 1970s, people started to realise it was worthwhile saving areas of forest, and we were also becoming aware of the number of birds that were becoming extinct in New Zealand. There was a couple of campaigns. I remember one was to save Lake Manapuri in the South Island, and another one which was dammed to generate electricity for a large industrial complex in the bottom of the South Island. And the second one I remember was a thing called Native Forest Action Council. There was a group of people got together to try to stop the Forest Service from logging some of the last of the, you could call it rainforest, jungle, if you like, jungle in New Zealand. So New Zealand was substantially covered by jungle originally, and then over the years of human occupation, the jungle was cut and burned for farmland. And the Forest Service in the 1980s was still doing that. So the Native Forest Action Council started a campaign which included chaining themselves to trees in some of the forests in the central North Island. I remember that quite well, and I was involved, I think, in selling t-shirts and things to make money for it. So that was in my mind when I left my job, which was not the adventurous job I wanted to work in, and I came out here to buy a piece of land. This was quite a forgotten place in those days. People didn't really know where Aotea, Great Barrow Island was. So I came out here and looked around for some land, and finally found this piece on the wilderness in the south end of the island, where you had to walk to get to it. And it was cheap enough for me to buy it, and it had original forest on it, which is quite unusual, probably because this is quite a damp valley, and the fires, when they were burning off to create farmland, didn't penetrate into the valley. So I bought the piece of land, and I've been coming back here every few years since, or every few months since, really. Originally, right at the beginning, I took down some buildings and built this little cabin here out of recycled materials. So that was my first adventure out here, coming out here in a boat and yachts to bring the materials out, and then bring it around the coast in a little dinghy. In those days, this island was had been farmed. Parts of the island had been farmed, but people had pretty much given up on that, and hippies were coming to live out here. So I was just on the tail end of the hippie era on Aotea. I wasn't really a hippie, but the people that I met out here were, some of them were. And that continued on for some time, that hippie era. And then of late, it's become more of a retirement place for people from Auckland, or people for holiday homes. So the changes on this island have been happening continuously since I've been here, really. But over the last 10 years, things have taken an exponential increase. So more and more people are coming out here to live here. So land is being divided up for sections and for holiday homes. But also there's a lot of pressure now from commercial interests for crayfishing and things like that, and from the people back in Auckland who come out here recreationally to take fish. So the land side is substantially being looked after out here. This island's turning into really just one large reserve. Almost everybody on this island is interested in conservation and looking after birds and the lizards that are here. Maybe a few exceptions, but there's very few people that aren't interested in that side of things. A lot of the areas that were once trees were taken off is now going back into native forest, that sort of thing. So the changes on this island have been continuous really since I've been here. Since the hippie era, more people have been coming out here to build holiday homes, and it's increased rapidly over the last 5 years probably. There's more sections being divided up for holiday homes. So, and there's also been an increased awareness in the necessity or the desire to look after the land, to return some of it to how it once was, and to retain any areas which are in native forest as they are, and to protect the birds and lizards from introduced species like introduced cats, pigs and rats are the main ones. So that is an ongoing thing, and it's very good. Seaside, recently there's been an increase in awareness in that too, I believe, but it is lagging a long way behind the awareness of the terrestrial, the land ecology. The sea ecology is, I was going to say it was more complicated, but it's probably no more complicated, but it's a lot harder to observe. You've got to put a mask and snorkel on and dive underneath the waves to actually see what's going on in the marine ecology. And I've been doing that continuously now for 45 years. Every year I come here many, many times, and I almost always dive. And I've observed many changes. There used to be a lot more penguins here on the beach. There used to be a lot more of certain species on the reef. There used to be a lot more kelp and seaweed. And these changes are only obvious to people like me that dive a lot. So there's a real need to draw attention to these issues by science. People got to do more science to draw attention to it. But I think really I'd like to draw, in my life, draw attention to these issues in the same way as attention was drawn to Puriora, not by chaining myself to the reef underwater, but by introducing more people to the idea, by making this awareness in the public greater. So I decided I would take some people on a kayaking trip around the island. I've kayaked right around the island a few times. It's not a trivial thing. You've got to get the weather right. You're right out in the ocean here, out in the Pacific Ocean. So you've got to be very, very careful with weather and conditions. There's not a lot of places where you can come ashore. So I had to be very careful taking young people around. But it's something I wanted to do because I believe that if we can raise the awareness in young people on these issues and at the same time video it as we did, that we may be able to draw attention to the marine environment. It's a complex issue. There's issues with the small fish being overtaken. There's too many of them being taken, and these are the fish at the bottom of the food pyramid that a lot of other species, including whales, need. There's issues with certain species like snapper, the big ones being taken, so the animals and the fish that they eat are getting out of control. There's a lot of issues. I can't go into all those issues in this series, but what I'd like to do is just to raise awareness from in the general public of these issues, and then hopefully pressure will be put on the government to make some changes. So does that answer your question?
No.
Do you wanna say you're here in this hut and a little bit about this hut, recycled materials, where some of the materials are from potentially, and what that means to you in terms of looking after the planet?
So this little hut that we're in here, I guess, is part of the belief I have and have had all my life. I remember my mother would never throw anything away. We had to recycle everything. And when I decided to build this little hut, I knew that I would never live here. I knew it was really just always going to be a place I'd come to do this sort of conservation work. So I didn't want to invest large amounts of money, but I also didn't want to think that I was expending any quantity of the planet's resources to make such a thing just for me to come to on occasion. It was part of my belief back then. So, and I've been reading these hippie books, and I decided I was going to try to make this hut out of entirely recycled materials, which it is. So the only things that have gone into this hut which are new was a tiny bit of concrete underneath the piles. The actual piles themselves, so these are the things that the hut sits on, they were actually new materials. And the nails that hold it together. Every single other thing is recycled from some other purpose. So even the water tank behind me came from something else. The boxes that I use for cupboards were boxes that arrived at my workplace when I was receiving equipment from overseas. The beams here are all recycled from testing laboratories, some of them. Some of the materials here probably actually originated on Aotea Great Barrier, or could well have done. There's kauri here, like the door beside me is kauri, and the timber up above is kauri. This timber here is Rimu. This beam here is kauri, and all that kauri could well have come from Great Barrier Island originally, because the kauri from here ended up in Auckland, but also in California or San Francisco. After the earthquake in San Francisco, they took kauri from here on Aotea and rebuilt some of these big cities. So the building I took down in Auckland could well have originated, the materials could have originated out here. The windows a friend gave me in Rotorua, he was replacing his windows, and they've done another 45 years of service out here. The doors in the front are actually kauri as well. They came from Taranaki, out of an old house. So the beds here, a friend gave me mattresses. So these are all things that are just reused, which is something I quite like about the hut. Every single thing here has got a memory. I can remember making that shelf, I can remember, which was at least 40 years ago. Yeah.
How did you go about making the hut?
So in those days, building a remote hut in a place like this was normally probably done by helicopter work. So you'd bundle the things up in a helicopter and drop them in. But that's not what I did. I took the hut, the first building I took down was in Rotorua, and I brought that material up, or had it trucked up by a trucking company to Auckland. And then it came across on an old barge called the Te Arawa, which was a trading boat which had been built with very flat bottom to take timber out of the estuaries around Nelson, I believe. And a guy called Tim Phipps owned it, and he was running goods out to Great Barrier Island, out to Aotea here, and that was the main way out. It took 8 hours. The day I brought the materials, I had my materials on board. There was a small storm came up, and we had to go to Kawa Island for 3 days while the storm calmed down. So I was immediately in the adventure that I'd been looking for. I'd been reading books like Kontiki by Tor Heyerdahl, who had done some trips, one from Peru into the Pacific on a balsa raft, trying to attempting to prove that people from that side of the Pacific had gone into Polynesia. And those sort of adventure books really were in my mind, and I wanted to have an adventure like that, and that's what I did. The materials came from Auckland in that barge across to Tryfeda, and then little bit by little bit I brought them around in a little aluminium dinghy, which I still have down on the beach. It's pretty old and battered now, with a little outboard motor, piece by piece, on calm days. And then I carried it from the coast up to here. Each of those trips up and down was about a half-hour return by the time I carried a big piece of wood up. I just carried the wood up all day. I was a young, fit man. And then I had to learn how to build buildings. So I had to go and look at other people's buildings and see how you build things. And then I slowly made this building. The building was made, the architecture of the building was totally determined by the pieces of wood I had, and changed as I got more bits of wood. So towards the end, I actually managed to get a whole lot of kauri beams from Auckland, so I made a steep roof upstairs based on the fact I had those beams. So that took 2 summers of bringing timber in here bit by bit by bit. And finally I had a closed-in hut, which was a big change from living in a tent. And since then I've been bringing people back. I bring people back here every year. Many, many, many people have been through. We have a hut book which is full of people's names, from a lot of them from foreign countries. who wanted to come and see a place like this. For many years I flew aeroplanes and used to fly people out here in a small aeroplane. So it's been very much a part of my life for a long time. And I think that's why I'd really like to do something for this island before I'm too old to do it, do any more. And one of those things is to try to quickly draw attention to the deterioration in the sea environment. The idea of this kayaking trip is to take 3 young people around the island and video what we find, and to talk to people we find as we go along. I believe these days, when I was young, I was very strongly influenced by books. I used to read and read and read books, and every book that I read left some sort of influence on me. I believe these days that books have probably almost become a redundant thing. I think most people now are influenced by what they see, and the videoing things and presenting things on the internet is probably the way you can influence people, probably in a totally different format from what we would have looked at when we were kids. We'd read a book and it might take a week to read a book. I think these days people need things in a very quick soundbite. So I decided to take a video person along with me, a video cameraman, and who was also a kayaker, and 2 other young people came along as well. So the idea was to take these people with us, see what we found, document the things we saw in the sea, and talk to the people we met as we went along. One of the ideas, one of the things that sparked my interest in doing this was a conversation I had with somebody on the island 2 years ago now. We were talking about these issues, the development on the island, the deterioration in the sea, and I said, well, how are you going to get all these people on the island? Most people on the island would like the island to be better, more looked after better environmentally. And this friend said, well, people should ask them what they think, ask them what they want. Nobody ever asks anybody. So that was also in my mind on this kayaking trip. I thought, when we go around, we'll talk to people and record what they say, no matter what they say. And that's also what we did. So we went around talking to the people we met, no matter who they were. It didn't matter whether they were a visitor to the island or somebody from Auckland or somebody that lived on the island. Just the people we met that wanted to talk to us, we talked to them and asked them what they thought and what they thought of the environment on the island and how it could be looked after.
And what was the nature of the trip for watching the weathers, the sort of quality of the kayaks and the food planning and all of that, what that went into it? How did you feel about the nature of all of that?
So I'm not sure. I guess the people that watch this video, they'll come from all different backgrounds. People that are used to an adventure trip, a trip with an element of danger in it, will know that a multi-day trip with multiple numbers of people requires a lot of planning. There's a lot of safety planning, and we decided to have many tiers of safety actually in the system. So I wasn't just going to take 3 young people out to sea and risk drowning them. We chose a time of year where waters were warm, up around 22 degrees, which means that if we had fallen in, we'd have a long period before we would suffer from exposure. But we also took a whole range of safety things with us. We had flares, we had what we call PLBs, which is a location system, which we can set off and people will come to look for us. But we also took something that I hadn't used before as a Garmin product called InReach, and that allowed us to communicate with our ground crew, which included Oshin, who was another one of the people we were taking, a conservation student. And Oshin was able to track us all the time and ensure that we were arriving in the place we were supposed to be arriving at the right time. And if we hadn't done, he could have contacted search and rescue. We also spoke to search and rescue people on the island before we left, so they knew what we were doing. However, even so, that I had to make a lot of other decisions as we went along. I decided in the previous trips I'd done, and we always went anti-clockwise, the wrong way around the island, if you like, not clockwise. And that's because there is a north to south current on this side, on the inside of the island, that we would be able to make use of as we came around. And it was also quite nice just to go in a logical sequence around the island. However, quite early on in the trip, I decided that that was not going to work because the weather was a little bit hard to predict, and the crew that I had with me were quite inexperienced kayakers. So I decided that I would jump from side to side and just pick the very best conditions I could, depending on the day, which meant that the trip was a bit not sequential around the island. We didn't really go the wrong way around. We went all different way around, which is the wrong way around too, I guess. So those things were in my mind all the way through, and building confidence in the crew was another big issue. But that's in the nature of an adventure trip. That's everybody that takes a group of people away has to do that. We're shaking down day at the beginning where we practice getting in and out of the kayaks, and then the next day we practiced beach landings, going into caves to build the confidence that we'd need to do some of the more difficult bits further on. A lot of those things I'll go into more depth later on, so I don't know whether you'd use that sequence that I just said, but
Yeah, this is good for building the whole picture. So out of the whole trip, just to reiterate, what did you want to get out of it, and what did you want to show people?
there's something I've heard said recently several times, and that is you'll never change people's minds by giving them numbers and statistics or science. And I think that's probably true, that science is a useful thing. It's useful to know what's ecologically happening in a reef system or in the ocean by measuring numbers, but the general public aren't influenced by graphs and numbers. What they're influenced by is probably more emotion. And what I want to get out of this is to take some of that emotion probably, and take some of that opinion from the people we met along the line, and then present it to the general public on the internet and in film festivals, that sort of thing. So that's what we set out to do. We haven't finished those films, so this is still work in progress. But I also wanted to take those young people with me on that ride, on that adventure, and I think that was successful. I think they enjoyed it. Nobody, when they finish a trip, has any understanding really of what it means to them. That only comes to them slowly. That awareness comes over months or years later, when they look back and realise that that thing they did was, A, exciting, B, interesting, and C, has educated them in some way. If you ask someone straight afterwards, they're just probably tired from the trip and emotionally exhausted. So I think that growing awareness in those three people I took away will happen over time. So those are the two levels of it. The level of the people we took, I'm sure that will happen. I certainly hope it will, where they'll look back on it and realise that it's slightly changed their life trajectory and made them more aware of their environment and greater desire to look after it. And I certainly believe that in some level we will get this film out, and that people will watch it and be influenced by it and make decisions or put pressure on the government, like they did with Poriora, to change the regulations about how many crayfish people take, change the regulations about how many scallops people take, change the regulations about how much the commercial fishing people here can take. So that's my desire, and I think it will happen. So some of it has happened. We completed the trip and we're still alive. I safely managed to get those people around the island, and they safely went back home. I totally believe they have learned a lot from it. The other objective of getting this film out to the public and having a large number of people watch it, so there will be influence placed on the government, that's yet to be seen. Hopefully that will happen too.
So what did you want to get out of the trip, and what did you want to show people, and what, even large or little, what did you want to have an influence of?
So there's two levels of thing I was trying to achieve on the island. I wanted to take a group of young people with me and have them learn about the environment, and hopefully they'll have an influence on things in the future in their own work and their own careers. That I'm sure will happen. The second thing I wanted to do was to record the opinions of other people. Hopefully by giving their opinion, those people will also focus their minds on how they'd like to see this island go in the future. And if that video can then go out to the wider audience on the internet, on film festivals, then we'll have an influence on that bigger community who can then have an effect on government and legislation. That legislation may be to reduce the amount of scallops things that people take, or the amount of crayfish, or it may be to affect the amount of bait fish people take. Reduce the commercial take. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not in government, but hopefully that awareness will mean that people will now start to focus on these reef environments, the way they did with Puriora in 1980s, late 1970s and 1980s. So I hope that will happen, and I think it will.
And what are you yourself proud of and inspired by this trip?
Well, I'm proud that once again, at the age of 66, I managed to get around the island. I also managed to get three people around the island with me. I'm sure there were times when those people probably would have preferred to have been somewhere else, but it's always the nature of a difficult trip. It was three weeks and quite difficult conditions at times, but we successfully got around and everybody enjoyed it, so I'm proud of that. And I also think that we actually achieved a second thing. We managed to get some very good interviews with some very interesting, respected and knowledgeable people on the island, but also people who we just came across who didn't fit any of those three categories, just people that had an opinion and were able to give us that opinion clearly on how this island could go in the future. So I'm quite proud of the quality of the interviews that we were able to make, and I'm proud of the fact that we got around successfully. We got around the island. We navigated the issues with weather and other issues we came across on the way.
And how have you come away feeling inspired?
I think before this trip, I was not really convinced that there was any hope that in my lifetime enough people would place pressure on the government or see the necessity to save reef environments. I now believe it will happen. I would absolutely love to see protection of some of these reefs here so that I could enjoy them the way I once did, but that probably won't happen in my lifetime. But I am inspired, and I do believe that change will happen. I think that's slowly, that awareness came as we talked to people on the island, because there were a lot of people that knew very well what should happen, and they knew quite clearly how that could happen. So I think that the knowledge is there, and the pressure will now be there to slowly pressure the government into making some changes quite rapidly. The bigger environment's much harder to try to put that influence out onto the whole of New Zealand is not going to happen very quickly at all. It probably won't happen on the whole marine environment around here. But there's already many cases in New Zealand where smaller environments have changed. Down in Fiordland, I think in the Marlborough Sounds, there's been changes. So there's no reason why those same changes can't happen in this environment here. And I think it will quite soon.
Okay.
Do we need to do it anymore?
Oh, unless there's anything else that you'd want to say. There's you can see what's in front of you, but you have to go under to see this. Is a good point. If you wanted to say that in any sort of different way.
Well, I was starting to get any might not use it. I was also do a little bit about penguins, and then it's probably enough for the night, because I'm starting to get tired. I am very, very tired. So for many years, I couldn't really work out why the marine environment was deteriorating so rapidly, and why people couldn't see that it was necessary to do something about it. I was down here one day on this beach, and I looked out and thought, oh, this is exactly the same as when I first came here. Thank goodness nothing has changed. It looks exactly as it did when I arrived here when I was 23 years old. It's the same rock, same bay, same birds almost flying overhead. And I thought, well, but it's not the same under the water. And then I realized why this has happened, why the marine environment, the reefs particularly, have deteriorated so badly. People cannot see under the waves. Most people spend their lives, if they are involved with the sea, sitting in boats, fishing or yachting, but they don't see underneath the waves. And underneath the waves is where it has changed. It hasn't changed on the surface. The number of fish they bring up from underneath may have changed, but the actual under the sea is where it's changed. So you have to be a diver to see that. And I've been a diver all my life. I don't dive with aqualung, but I dive with snorkels, so I can see the top little bit where most of the life is. And I've been doing that every few months for 43 years now here in this one bay. So I've seen the changes. So I think that's what it is. That is why it has been allowed to go this way, that people don't know that they can see the forests being cut down as they drive along the road, but they can't see what's happened underneath as the marine environment's been cut down by overfishing. One of the things I think that alerted me first to the changes here was the numbers of penguins. We used to have penguins all through the bush here at night in the nesting season. And when we went down to the beach, there was dozens of penguins on the beach. We went out 2 nights ago and covered about 1 kilometre of beach along here to see. At night, these small penguins come ashore just for a rest from the waves. So in the old days, we would have seen dozens and dozens of them. The night before last, we saw 9 penguins, I think, on the beach. And there's only about 3 nests that I know of now, where at one stage there was dozens of nests. So this was something I noticed and started to read about it and realised that these penguins are dependent on the same fish that we're now eating and using for fish food and things like that. So we're taking those fish, those small fish that the penguins need, and we're using them for fish farms and for pet food and exporting them and using them to catch other fish. So these are what they call bait fish, fish we put in plastic bags and we can buy at a hardware store or at a fishing store or at a garage in New Zealand to go out and catch other fish. So we're taking those little fish and using them so that the other animals and birds, the birds and the fish don't have enough to eat. So that was one of the first things I really noticed, was this lack of penguins. And then I started observing and looking at the other issues and reading around and realised that the oceans were in a very bad state. So for the last 5 years or more, I've been attempting to raise awareness in those things. What else was I going to say in there? Do you want me to chop any of those bits down and just say them as shorter bits in case you want to use it a different way?
No, I don't think we should go around in circles.
So I don't know that any of that's useful, but at least it's down now. So what we can do is use that as placeholders, and if we decide it needs to be done again, I can just do it as a talk over, but at least you can chop that up and